Alright guys, so this is your economic war update and the sanctions regime on Russia isn't over yet. We have gone from asset confiscation to price caps on Russian oil. Now both of these have of course backfired. Putin counter-seized Western company assets, and to bypass the oil sanctions, Russia expanded their network of shadow fleets. The West is still planning yet another hit back on Russian commodity production. Trying to curb revenue, that's their plan, but they will hurt themselves in the process. The US is now telling the G7 to punish Russian palladium and titanium, critical metals used throughout the industry. But Europe is resisting the sanctions. Trying to ban Russian metals at this point in time is quite crazy, especially when they are trying to build back their military. The EU economy is losing their civilian industries, and whether it's the auto industry or making chemicals, global demand for EU products is decreasing. And what is the one sector that's going to be evergreen? It's going to be defense. Italy, for example, is moving more towards a war economy. Their auto industry is in trouble. Production has fallen from 750,000 units in 2023 to less than half a million this year. You add in the fact that China is telling their EV companies to halt EU expansion, countries like Italy, they are feeling the squeeze. And that's why the government is moving nearly $5 billion from the auto industry into defense. This dramatic shift will continue because Europe, they are running out of options. Energy costs are too high, so manufacturing vehicles are becoming less and less competitive. The same situation is happening in Germany as well. Rheinmetall is a German defense manufacturer. They build everything from armored tanks to artillery shells, and business, well, it's booming. While companies like Volkswagen, they are firing German workers, Rheinmetall is hiring. More than 4,000 defense jobs were created from 2021 to 2023. The idea of a Russian threat is a great business for the economy of war. Plus, the threat of a Trump victory is really making Europe quake in their boots. For decades, the US has been subsidizing Europe's defense through NATO. The US provided the defense while Europe could take their money and focus on other industry. But this situation is about to reverse quite dramatically. Donald Trump might be the next US president, just look at the polls today. And he has said many times that Europe has to pay their fair share.
During a meeting, one of the presidents of one of the European countries stood up, and it was a closed-door meeting. He said, may I ask you a question, Mr. President? Yes. If we don't pay, we're not paid up, and we're attacked by Russia, will you defend us? I said, you mean you're delinquent? You haven't paid? That's right. No, I will not defend you.
This is crystal clear. If Europe doesn't pay, Trump won't defend them. And this complicates the situation for countries like Germany, who are struggling rather badly. JD Vance has also warned the Germans in no uncertain terms. You have to step up your defense spending, and that China, not Russia, is the top threat to the West. The US would remain in NATO, but you need to pay protection money or your insurance policy will lapse. And this leaves Europe in an impossible situation. They can either pay the Americans to defend Europe, or they can build up their own military-industrial complex. Germany and Italy wants to build back their defense industry base, but the cost will be staggering. Since the Soviets collapsed in the 1990s, the defense budget in Europe was slashed down. The biggest economies, especially Spain and the UK, cut their defense budgets by almost 50%. Italy reduced theirs by 9%, while Germany is still down by 28%. And that's after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To build back their defense industry, Europe will have to spend tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions just to catch up. However, this brings us back to the topic of banning Russian metals. Just like any other manufacturer, building weapons needs critical inputs. Your energy costs are already through the roof, so that is strike one. Secondly, countries like Germany, they have a manpower shortage of skilled labor. That's strike two. This pushes salaries up. And now, trying to sanction Russian metals will be strike three. All your input costs will fly to the moon. Palladium is needed to make computer chips and catalytic converters for cars. Since the EV push is collapsing in Europe, companies like Volkswagen, they still need palladium for their ICE vehicles. Titanium, on the other hand, has key military uses. It's not just for airplane parts, it's necessary to build missiles and armor plating as well. Throughout the MIC, you need platinum. The problem the West faces is Russia's supply dominance. Just like how China controls the supply of EV minerals, Russia has a stranglehold on palladium and titanium. Russia accounts for 30 to 40% of the global palladium production. They produce around 74 tons and only loses out to South Africa. All this comes from one single Russian company, Nornickel. As countries like Germany fall back on ICE vehicles, they need the price of palladium to stay constant. And the last time the G7 threatened to sanction Russian metals, palladium prices soared by 12%. Even the US today still buys Russian palladium for combustion car production. So it's really a case of cutting off your nose to spite the face. Punishing Russia is very different from hitting countries like Iran because of their huge production. Global supply chains will adjust around the G7 sanctions. The global south is expanding faster than the west, and as a result, they are consuming more Russian metals, including palladium. Nornickel, the Russian company, used to sell the majority of production to the EU. In 2022, Europe accounted for nearly 50% of sales. But just a year later, the situation has flipped. Asia now accounts for 54% of total sales. Total production has gone up, and Asia is now Russia's biggest customer. Any sanctions will only help bring prices down for BRICS, while prices will go up for the West. It's really counterproductive, especially if the EU wants to save their industries. When it comes to titanium, a metal for military and aerospace production, Russia also controls the supply chain here. It's really becoming a common theme. The West might control global financial systems, but commodity production really belongs to the East. In 2020, Russia accounted for 13% of global output and exports of titanium. In fact, one single company in Russia accounts for the majority of global exports as well. Trying to ban Russian exports will cripple Western industries. So when the US calls for the G7 to stop importing titanium from Russia, they are telling Europe to further deindustrialize. And here's how big the hypocrisy is. In 2022, Russia exported 15,000 tons of titanium, worth nearly $400 million to the West. And this included countries like Germany, the US, and France at the top of the list. This is the importance of supply chains. As much as the West, they say they want to decouple from Russia, they simply can't. Unlike financial instruments, you can't really conjure the physical metal production from thin air. Someone has to go out into the mines, dig it out of the ground, and then refine it. Big European industries, they rely a lot on Russian titanium to stay competitive. 67% of imports goes into civil aerospace, while 29% goes into industrial equipment. Now, we are talking about companies like Boeing and Airbus. They have to rely on Russian metals to keep the cost of production down. Both of them are competitors, and if either of them give up Russian supply, the other aerospace maker would win. Nearly 70% of titanium consumption is from the aerospace sector, and this poses a big problem for Europe. We know China, they are building their own jet plane maker. Comac is expanding really fast, and their cost of production is getting really competitive. So if the West loses their Russian titanium supply, China will win big here. When we look under the hood, despite all the bravado of never-ending sanctions, Europe still relies a lot on Russian supply chains. The problem the EU faces is an America who's ready to collect their protection money. The Trump camp has made this abundantly clear, and there's no getting around this fact.
Donald Trump and I have said is that there shouldn't be a free lunch for Europe or anybody else. America is not the policeman of the world, and NATO should be a military alliance where Germany, France, and all these other countries pay their fair share rather than relying on American taxpayers to subsidize their defense so they can have generous welfare states while American veterans are sleeping under park benches. It's ridiculous, Shannon. We want NATO to be a real alliance, and the way that it's going to be a real alliance is for Europe to pay up to do what's necessary and to allow us to focus on the most pressing foreign policy challenge we have had in nearly a century, and that is China. And that is what Donald Trump and I are going to focus on.
This poses a very interesting dilemma. It's just like relations between the US and China. America is borrowing money from Beijing to buy stuff made in China in order to contain the Chinese economy. The same thing goes for Europe. They have to buy Russian commodities to build up their military, to arm Ukraine and fight back against Putin. And here's how crazy things will get for NATO's defense expenditure. In 2024, Europe and Canada's defense spending will explode by nearly 18%. That's a very big financial commitment. In the EU, GDP growth is well under 1%. Countries like Germany, they are on the brink of recession. So the money will have to come from debt and deficits. The former head of the ECB, Draghi, wants the EU to spend money like drunken sailors. He wants almost $1 trillion a year of extra spending from Europe. This means issuing a ton of bonds to make the EU more competitive against China and the US. But once again, this is only part of the equation. You can't fix an industrial problem with financial engineering. Even if Europe spends $10 trillion, it still doesn't solve the fundamental issue, which is getting the inputs to be competitive against the US and China. And that obviously means cheap energy and metal imports from Russia. They've already lost one and they can't afford to lose the other. At the end of the day, there's going to be winners and losers of this economic war. And we have said many times that Europe is holding the bag. They've spent a lot and they haven't really gotten much in return. At least the US is strategic by telling the G7 to cut away cheap Russian gas. They get to sell the Europeans expensive LNG. So there's some method behind the madness. This chart shows us the growth of exports of the major economies around the world, and we can see where Europe stacks up with the competition. Since 2010, China's exports have grown by 18%. Exports from the US have grown by 15%. On average, global exports have increased by 7%. But Europe's performance is a disaster. Exports have collapsed by 4%. And understand what this means. In 2024, the volume of EU exports will be less than 14 years ago. This is a problem. It's a clear sign that your industrial base is dropping. The EU manufacturing is in crisis mode and is so bad that global demand for your goods is dropping. Trying to impose more sanctions on Russia is simply crazy. Well, it might happen because of ideology and politics, and if it does, many EU industries would collapse even further. But let me know what you think. Will Europe listen to the US again? And is a Russian metals ban coming soon? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.